Berlin, April 30th, 1945. The city that once stood as the symbol of a 1,000-year empire now lay in ruin. The smell of smoke and ash filled the air, the distant roar of artillery echoing like thunder from every direction. Streets once paraded by soldiers were now choked with debris and silence. Beneath the burning skyline, deep within the Führerbunker, Adolf Hitler faced the inevitable. Outside, the Red Army advanced block by block, their tanks grinding over the bones of a dying regime. Civilians huddled in dark basements, listening to the walls tremble with each explosion, whispering prayers for an end they no longer feared, only awaited. In those final hours, the once proud capital of the Third Reich had become a ghost city. Desperation ruled its streets, loyalty, madness, and survival intertwined in a final act written by fate itself. This is the story of how Berlin fell, not just as a battlefield, but as a symbol of human will, delusion, and collapse. The story of the empire that burned from within, January 1940. The heart of Europe trembled beneath a frozen sky. From the east, the Red Army surged forward like a relentless tide. From the west, the Allies pressed in across the Rhine. The empire that once stretched across the continent was collapsing piece by piece. Yet inside Berlin, the illusion of control persisted. A city bound by fear, pride, and denial. Posters still declared Endsieg. Final victory. But even the most loyal eyes could see the truth burning on the horizon. The once proud boulevards of Unter den Linden and Wilhelmstrasse were cloaked in black smoke. Anti-aircraft guns lined rooftops. Children too young to shave carried rifles too heavy to lift. They called them the Volkssturm, the People's Storm, a desperate last stand of fathers, students, and old men pressed into uniform. Every night, the air raid sirens wailed across the capital like mourning cries for a dying world. In the shelter tunnels, Berliners whispered that the Russians were only days away. Rumors spread like fire. Tales of atrocities, of vengeance, of the Red Army's unstoppable march. But above ground, the propaganda machine still turned. Goebbels' voice echoed through the radio, his promises of victory sounding hollow against the thunder of Soviet artillery. In the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler refused to leave. His face pale, his hands trembling from illness and rage, he studied maps littered with phantom divisions, armies that no longer existed. His generals, once bold and confident, now spoke carefully, choosing every word like men walking a minefield. Every report that reached him was filtered, softened, or rewritten to preserve a fading illusion. General Heinrizi, commanding the defense of the Oder front, had pleaded for permission to withdraw. His lines were collapsing under the weight of over 2 million Soviet troops, but Hitler would hear none of it. "Berlin must not fall," he ordered. "Not while I live." His world had narrowed to a single bunker, yet he still imagined himself master of an empire that no longer existed. Outside the walls of the city, the storm gathered. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, S1st Belarusian Front, and Marshal Ivan Konev, S1st Ukrainian Front, closed the iron circle around Berlin. Soviet artillery massed in the forests along the Oder River, thousands of barrels pointed west. At dawn on April 16th, the sky erupted in a storm of fire, the largest bombardment in European history. The ground shook for miles. Entire villages vanished under the weight of shell fire. Berliners awoke to what they called der Höllenlärm, the noise of hell. In the eastern suburbs, the night sky glowed red as thousands of rockets streaked overhead. Soviet soldiers advanced through the smoke, shouting, "Za Rodinu, za Stalina!" For every step they took, another German position fell. Entire battalions vanished overnight, swallowed by the flood of war. Yet inside the bunker, time seemed frozen. The corridors smelled of damp concrete, cigarette smoke, and hopelessness. Hitler's inner circle had gathered like moths around a dying flame. Goebbels still preached loyalty. Eva Braun smiled faintly, her laughter forced but defiant. Secretaries typed final orders they knew would never be carried out. Martin Bormann guarded access to Hitler's chamber like a zealot protecting a false god. Above them, Berlin's citizens fought their own battles. Housewives carried buckets of water to douse flames. Doctors operated by candlelight. The Berlin Zoo, once a place of wonder, became a graveyard of starving animals, their roars replaced by distant explosions. The Spree River ran black with oil and ash. As Soviet tanks approached the city's outskirts, the defenders prepared for urban combat. The SS, still loyal to the end, fortified intersections with sandbags and wrecked vehicles. Snipers took positions in church towers. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Germany, could barely send a handful of aircraft into the air. The skies that once belonged to the Eagle now belonged to the Storm. Inside the Führerbunker, Hitler ordered Operation Clausewitz, the final defense of Berlin. The city was divided into sectors, each commanded by officers who knew the outcome was already written. General Helmuth Weidling, appointed to lead the city's defense, faced the impossible, to hold a shattered capital with broken men and dwindling ammunition. By April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday, the Red Army had reached the city limits. Instead of celebration, the day was marked by despair. Bombs fell so close that the ground above the bunker trembled. Hitler emerged briefly into the garden of the Reich Chancellery. Witnesses say he shook hands with a group of Hitler youth, boys barely 14, and thanked them for their bravery. As he looked into their faces, a rare flicker of emotion crossed his eyes. Perhaps pride, perhaps guilt, perhaps realization. That night, the last telegrams from the front arrived. One after another, the reports confirmed the inevitable. No relief would come. Field Marshal Keitel's reserves had been crushed. Steiner's counterattack, the one Hitler had pinned his hopes on, was a phantom. There was no army left to save Berlin. Still, the orders continued. Fight to the last man. Surrender is treason. The SS obeyed. The Wehrmacht hesitated. Civilians simply prayed. In the west, American forces paused at the Elbe River, allowing the Soviets to claim Berlin. It was a political choice, one that would shape the post-war world. By April 25th, the Soviet forces had completely encircled the capital. No one could leave. The city became a fortress of fire. Artillery shells rained down day and night. Buildings collapsed into ash. The sound of the front drew closer with every hour. In those final days, the line between soldier and civilian disappeared. Teenage boys fought beside old men. Nurses carried rifles. Women cooked soup for the dying in shattered courtyards. Even as shells exploded above them, Berliners clung to fragments of life. A radio song, a prayer, a photograph saved from the flames. In the bunker below, Hitler's world was shrinking to a single room. Maps were meaningless now. His voice grew weaker, his eyes darker, his faith consumed by bitterness. He accused his generals of betrayal, his people of cowardice. In his final conferences, witnesses described a man already dead, a ghost pacing the corridors of his own making. Above him, the city that once represented the power of his dream was dying with him. April 26, 1945. Berlin was no longer a city. It was a furnace. Smoke coiled over the ruins, turning day into twilight. Soviet artillery thundered from every direction, their shells smashing through streets already broken beyond recognition. The air smelled of iron, oil, and death. The once proud heart of the Reich beat slower with each passing hour. In the east, the Soviets had reached Alexanderplatz. In the south, their tanks rolled past Tempelhof. The defenders, trapped in shrinking pockets of resistance, fought with what little they had left, rifles with 5 bullets, Molotov cocktails, and a faith that had long since turned into despair. Every street became a battlefield, every doorway a last stand. The wounded lay where they fell, too many to count, too many to save. From the bunker deep below the Reich Chancellery, the sound of destruction was constant, distant but unending, like a storm that would never pass. The walls shook with every impact, fine dust falling from the ceiling like grey snow. In those corridors, time began to lose meaning. The clock still ticked, but no one trusted them. There was no longer day or night, only the slow descent into the end. Hitler had stopped appearing in the main conference room. He moved between his private quarters and the map room in silence, his body stooped, his face pale and drawn. The tremor in his hands was constant now, his voice dry and brittle. Gone was the fiery orator who once commanded nations. What remained was a man consumed by paranoia, rage, and denial. He accused his generals of betrayal, screaming that they had failed him. He ordered phantom divisions to attack, divisions that existed only in his imagination. When the truth could no longer be denied, when every radio message confirmed the Soviets were within blocks of the Chancellery, something inside him broke. Witnesses described the moment as eerie, as if a switch had been thrown. The fury vanished, the shouting stopped. He spoke calmly, coldly, almost detached, as he accepted that the war was lost. That same day, Eva Braun announced she would not leave his side. She had spent most of the war in shadow, hidden away from the world, a silent figure in a collapsing court. Now she appeared radiant in defiance. She smiled as shells exploded above, as though laughter could erase the fear. "I am not afraid," she told one of the secretaries. "I will die with him." Above ground, the Soviets closed in on the Reichstag, the symbol of Nazi power. The battle for that building was fought metre by metre, floor by floor. Machine guns chattered through the corridors, grenades burst through smoke-filled halls, and bayonets gleamed in the flickering light of fire. The Soviet flag, red and tattered, was raised and torn down again and again before it finally remained, a symbol of the Empire's death cry. Inside the bunker, the mood turned surreal. Goebbels and his wife Magda prepared their 6 children for what they called the peaceful end. They dressed them in white nightgowns, combed their hair, and gave them morphine to sleep before crushing cyanide capsules between their teeth. The bunker, once the center of command, had become a tomb of quiet madness. Hitler called his final conference on April 29th. The sound of artillery shook the walls as he spoke to his staff for the last time. His words were calm, deliberate. He thanked them for their service, then dismissed them. To his secretaries he offered a faint smile. "You have been brave women," he said softly. "I thank you." Later that night, he dictated his political and personal testament. In it, he blamed the war's failure on his generals, on the Jews, on fate, never on himself. He appointed Karl Dönitz as his successor and declared that he would never be captured alive. "I will die here in Berlin," he said. "It is my decision." The next morning, April 30th, the shelling grew heavier. The bunker's lights flickered as Soviet troops stormed the nearby Tiergarten. Hitler emerged briefly to bid farewell to his remaining aides. He shook hands, nodded silently, and disappeared into his private room with Eva Braun. The door closed quietly behind them. At 3:30 p.m., those waiting outside heard a sharp crack, a sound that cut through the endless bombardment. Moments later, the door opened. Hitler was seated on the sofa, a pistol in his hand, a dark stain spreading across his uniform. Eva lay beside him, her face serene, a faint scent of cyanide in the air. The empire that had plunged the world into fire had ended with a whisper beneath the earth. His body was carried upstairs, wrapped in a grey blanket, and laid in the garden behind the Chancellery. Gasoline was poured over it. As the flames rose, the last remnants of the Reich went up in smoke. Soviet shells burst nearby, sending ashes swirling through the air like black snow. Inside the bunker, Goebbels wept, not for Hitler, but for the dream he believed had died unjustly. That night, he and Magda followed their children into death, swallowing poison as the fire from above reached the surface of their world below. Outside, the Soviets pressed through the ruins. Every building, every cellar, every street corner became a skirmish. Civilians surrendered in waves, waving makeshift white flags torn from bedsheets. For many, capture meant survival. For others, it meant terror. The Red Army had fought too long, lost too many to show mercy easily. On May the 1st, the Soviet troops reached the bunker complex. They found the garden littered with charred remains, the smell of gasoline still lingering. Inside, they discovered empty corridors, extinguished lamps, and silence. The war, at least in Berlin, was over. But for the survivors, the end brought no peace. The city was a skeleton of stone and smoke. Women searched for missing children. Soldiers stumbled through the ruins, their uniforms stained with dust and blood. For the first time in 12 years, Berlin heard no speeches, no anthems, no marching feet, only the quiet hum of wind through broken windows. In Moscow, news of Hitler's death spread like wildfire. Stalin ordered his troops to verify it. He would not believe until the remains were found. For days, Soviet investigators sifted through the rubble, piecing together fragments of bone, fabric, and teeth. History itself had to prove that the monster was truly gone. Yet even with his death, the shadow he cast did not fade. The ideology he built, the hatred he unleashed, would scar generations. The world had won the war, but at a cost too high to measure. More than 70 million lives had been extinguished. Cities lay in ruins from Tokyo to Warsaw. Families vanished without trace. And in the ashes of Berlin, a new world was already beginning to take shape. Divided by borders drawn in fear and suspicion. May 2nd, 1945. The guns of Berlin finally went silent. What remained was not victory, only survival. The streets were rivers of mud and glass. Buildings stood like blackened teeth against a grey sky. The smell of smoke, cordite, and decay hung over the ruins. For the first time in years, there were no banners, no orders, no anthem. Only the slow shuffle of people emerging from cellars, blinking into daylight that felt unreal. The Red Army moved through the city like ghosts in steel helmets, their faces drawn and hollow from months of relentless fighting. They carried the weight of vengeance and exhaustion in equal measure. Some offered bread to children, others scrawled their names across the walls of the Reichstag in chalk and blood. Above the shattered dome, the red flag fluttered in the wind, a symbol not only of triumph, but of the new world to come. Inside the Reich Chancellery, Soviet officers inspected the bunker. The corridors smelled of fuel and burnt fabric. They found overturned furniture, scattered papers, and the remains of a regime that had consumed itself. In a nearby room lay the charred outline of a sofa, the place where a war that had swallowed continents finally ended. Across Germany, the news spread slowly. On the Western Front, American and British soldiers halted their advance at the Elbe River. They lit cigarettes and stared eastward, knowing that beyond the smoke lay not allies but rivals. The handshake between Soviet and American troops at Torgau had been cordial, even joyful. Yet beneath it lingered an uneasiness, the recognition that peace would not unite the world but divide it. The Allies called it liberation. For many Germans, it felt like awakening from a nightmare only to find the world in ruins. Entire cities, Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, were flattened. Millions were displaced. In the east, refugees trudged along endless roads, pushing carts piled with whatever remained of their lives. Mothers carried infants wrapped in blankets. Old men limped behind, silent. No one looked back. Berlin became a city of shadows. The Soviets established their headquarters in the ruins. Their soldiers patrolled intersections once ruled by the SS. Hunger became the new enemy. People traded watches for bread, shoes for cigarettes, dignity for a few hours of warmth. The black market thrived among the rubble, a quiet war for survival fought beneath the watchful eyes of the victors. In July 1945, the leaders of the victorious powers met in Potsdam, just outside the ruined capital. Truman, Churchill, and Stalin sat at a long table inside Sicilienhof Palace. Outside, the gardens were in bloom, but the air carried tension thicker than gunpowder. Maps were spread before them, not of battlefields, but of borders. Germany was carved like a wounded animal, 4 zones of occupation: Soviet, American, British, and French. Berlin, though deep in Soviet territory, would be split the same way. It was an uneasy peace. What began as alliance soon hardened into suspicion. The Soviets viewed the Western presence in Berlin as intrusion. The Americans saw Stalin's grip on Eastern Europe as betrayal. Between them lay the ruins of a continent too broken to choose sides. The lines drawn that summer would harden into the frontiers of a new conflict, the Cold War. For ordinary Germans, the world shifted overnight. Denazification tribunals began, pulling teachers, soldiers, and bureaucrats into rooms where their loyalties were measured and judged. Some faced prison, others quietly returned to work under new flags. In the East, Soviet officers installed a new government loyal to Moscow. In the West, the Americans promoted reconstruction and reform. Both sides claimed to rebuild Germany, but in truth, they were building 2 different nations. By 1948, Berlin had become the symbol of that division. In the Soviet zone, factories were dismantled and shipped east as reparations. In the Western zones, the Marshall Plan poured billions into rebuilding industry. The difference grew visible: streets repaired in the West, ration lines in the East. When the Western Allies introduced a new currency, Stalin responded with a blockade, cutting off all land routes into West Berlin. For nearly a year, the city, once crushed by bombs, now faced starvation again. But this time, salvation came from the sky. Allied aircraft roared over the ruins day and night, delivering food, coal, and hope. The Berlin airlift became the first battle of the New World, a war fought not with guns, but with endurance. Every landing on Tempelhof-S shattered runway was a reminder that freedom could survive even behind enemy lines. Meanwhile, across Europe, the scars of the war refused to fade. In Poland, mass graves were unearthed. In France, collaborators were tried. In the Soviet Union, victory came at the cost of 20 million lives. Cities celebrated, but homes remained empty. Soldiers returned with haunted eyes, carrying memories they would never speak aloud. In Nuremberg, justice took the stage. The surviving architects of the Nazi regime sat behind glass in the courtroom, their faces pale and expressionless. One by one, they heard their crimes read aloud: numbers, names, places. For the first time in history, war itself was put on trial. The verdicts came like thunder: guilty, guilty, guilty. Yet no sentence could balance the scale of what had been done. Outside the courtroom, the world moved on. Children played among the ruins, new borders hardened, soldiers went home, but the fear remained that the ashes of one empire might become the foundation of another. By 1949, 2 Germanys existed: the Federal Republic in the West, the German Democratic Republic in the East. Between them ran an invisible scar that would soon turn to concrete and barbed wire, and so the city that once symbolized domination became the frontier of division. Berlin was both prisoner and witness, a place where East watched West across a single street. The echoes of 1945 never stopped reverberating through its alleys and courtyards. Even decades later, when the Cold War froze the world into silence, Berlin's ruins whispered of fire, loss, and redemption. For those who lived through the fall, the memories never left. They spoke of the smell of burning paper, of the rumble of tanks echoing down the boulevards, of the strange quiet that followed the last explosion. Some remembered the Red Army's soldier who shared his bread. Others remembered the screams in the night. History rarely offers purity. It offers survival and the price that comes with it. The ashes of Berlin nurtured new beginnings. Within a decade, the western half of the city thrived under reconstruction. Lights returning to Kurfürstendamm, trains running again beneath the streets. In the east, banners of socialism replaced swastikas, and statues of Lenin rose where eagles once stood. Yet beneath both flags the same question lingered: how does a nation live with its own memory, The Cold War turned that question into policy. Espionage replaced open battle. The sound of bombers was replaced by whispers in back alleys, by agents trading secrets under flickering streetlights. The Iron Curtain fell across Europe, cutting families apart as surely as any front line. The same land that had birthed the Third Reich now became the fault line of global tension. But history, like the city it haunts, endures. When the Berlin Wall finally crumbled in 1989, crowds flooded the streets where the last battles of 1945 had been fought. They sang, they cried, they climbed over concrete that had divided them for 40 years. The same square where Soviet soldiers once raised the red flag now echoed with a different chant: freedom. Yet beneath the celebration, the ghosts of that April still lingered, in the museums, in the faded photographs, in the minds of those who remember the smell of fire and the sound of collapsing stone. The war had ended, but its lessons remained, etched into the soul of humanity. Berlin stands today as both monument and warning, a city reborn from its own destruction, where glass towers rise above the bones of the past. Tourists walk the same streets once lined with rubble. Children play in parks built over air raid shelters. And somewhere, beneath the layers of earth and memory, the silence of that last day still waits. The fall of Berlin was not just the end of a war, it was the beginning of the world we live in now. The borders drawn in its ashes shaped generations, alliances, and fears that still echo through the headlines of today. Because history does not end, it transforms, from empire to ruin, from ruin to rebirth, and in every echo a reminder: power fades, but memory endures. Until next time, stay safe, and see you in the next history.